very much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm a research ecologist with ARS, and for most of my career, most of my work has been done in field plots on experimental stations. And over time, it's become really clear to me that that's not enough, that the results are limited, that they're not always relevant to growers, and that sometimes the questions aren't always relevant to growers. So this talk ties into what Bill left off with at the end of his talk with that Regenerate Illinois movement. And I'll be telling you about some things that we're doing with that group and talking about farmer networks more generally. So farmer networks, there are lots of growers in this room. I can see lots of familiar faces. Farmers are the experts in agriculture. I'm an expert in research, in agricultural research, but I'm a student of agriculture. You guys are the experts. And so that's why I'm talking about leveraging years of experience and practical knowledge here. I think it's really time that we change our research model and our extension model and our marketing model so that it's farmer-driven. So in this talk, I have three main sections. The first is just why farmer networks are important. Second, I'll talk to you about some existing farmer networks. And then finally, I'll talk to you about some things that farmer networks can do. So, starting off, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this organization, Practical Farmers of Iowa. So this is a farmer network that I have a lot of respect for. It was formed in 1985 during the farm crisis by Dick and Sharon Thompson. And they formed it because they were in danger of going out of business. And the whole idea behind PFI, the early idea anyway, was how to reduce input costs. So they talked to their neighbors, and their neighbors invited their friends, and they began to have these sit-down sessions where they discussed how can we reduce how much money we're spending on the input side of agriculture. Now later, of course, that ties into some environmental goals as well, and that became a feature of what PFI does. But really, in the very beginning, that practical part of it was highly emphasized, and it's still emphasized. I think that their motto, working together, always learning, could effectively describe the people in this room, right? So we're here together, and we're here to learn, and we're lifelong learners. The mission of PFI is to strengthen farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. So that's a really key part of this. On-farm trials tend to look different than experiment station trials, and the questions that are being asked tend to look different as well. So this is Dick standing in his soybean field that's been not cultivated, it was a ridge-tilled, And so one of the things that he was doing early on was trying to reduce weed management costs by adopting ridge tillage. So he was reducing the amount of soil disturbance, but also really directing where that soil was going. You can see that, they've got this idyllic little farmstead there, and they had animals on their farm. They raised a diversity of crops. It's not, a 2,000-acre cash grain only operation. It was diversified even then, and they found that they had to diversify in order to make their farm profitable. This is what the PFI website for the cooperators looks like now. PFI has grown to over 3,000 members. Okay, so there are many chapters throughout Illinois, and then there are folks like me who go to their meetings because we admire them, maybe envy them. So the Cooperators program has a few basic things that you have to do. So you have to attend Cooperators meetings, and these meetings are part planning sessions, but also these meetings are learning sessions. So you gather around a topic that you're mutually interested in. And then a second part of this is developing a research idea together. What are we actually going to look at on farm? And then the final thing is to report out what you did to the rest of the group. And this is a different type of report than you might see in a research article. This is a one-page kind of nuts and bolts. Here's what we did. Did it actually affect our yields or the problems on our farms? PFI has an annual meeting, takes place during January, and I encourage you, if you haven't been to this meeting, to go. It's really inspiring. So I was a grad student at Iowa State back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I went to these meetings and learned a lot. One of the things that happens at these meetings is that there are farmer-led workshops and a few researcher-led workshops. So I led one this time on diversifying crop rotations. The farmer-to-farmer information exchange that takes place at these winter meetings is really extraordinary. Because everyone in that room has some lived experience, and because farming differs from place to place, there are a lot of really unique perspectives on how a given production system should be operated. You'll also see cooperator reports at these PFI meetings, so people will report directly back on their on-farm research. And there will be awards. So this is John and Beverly Gilbert, who got the Sustainable Agriculture Award this year at the PFI meeting. They run a 770-acre diversified crop and livestock farm. And they embody this message of pass it on. That was this year's conference's message. So this idea that, farming in some sense not only is a practical activity, but it has an oral history to it. And you learn things, in 30, 40, 50 years of managing a piece of ground. And those are things that are useful and specific and that are very difficult to pass on just through a research article. And so this idea that direct farmer-to-farmer contact can keep this oral history going is a really important part of what a farmer network can do. Also, at this network were these learning community meetings. So this was on organic livestock health. And within that meeting, there was a university facilitator, but then growers were offering their own perspectives on this issue. All right, so I think that in addition to just producing healthy food, these are 5 of the features that really embody practical farmers of Iowa. So community, forming a long-term community that persists from year to year. Illinois has small grower groups and other agricultural sustainability groups, but what I haven't noticed is a larger kind of big tent that invites a lot of people in. So one of the things I esteem about PFI is this idea that people from all types of farms across time are building community. Trust is another big issue here. So I know that when people are competing for the same piece of ground out in the countryside, sometimes you don't want to talk to each other about what you're doing on your land because you don't want to give your competitor an edge. So one of the things about these learning communities is this idea of not holding your cards so close to your chest, building trust over time because these people are no longer your competitors so much as your collaborators. Relevance is another really big thing here. So Bill was talking before about breeding organic grains because in order to diversify, we need grains that work in organic systems. That's an area of research that hasn't received a lot of attention in the scientific establishment up till now. But that's a farmer-driven concern that can then get picked up by the research community to take it further. Stewardship, by cover crops or diversification or low input practices, is a clear feature of PFI's mission, but that has grown over time as kind of an add-on to the first mission, which was economy and saving money and actually making ends meet in the farm. And then this final aspect of continuity is really, really key. We know that the farm population in this country is aging, and that there's really a huge need for new growers, and the Land Connection does great work in this area in training and making these connections between new and established growers. So I believe that these 5 pillars, 5 characteristics of PFI have made it a great organization and one that we should emulate. So these yellow circles represent University of Illinois' research centers around the state. And we do some decent research there, but one of the problems with these research centers is that they're often located on the best ground in that particular part of the state. And I think that when we think about really creating research that's relevant to growers, we also need to think about spreading our research out across the landscape. So these stars represent what might happen if we had a network of farms that was spread geographically from north to south across the state. And so I'd like to introduce to you a new effort by that Regenerate Illinois group. So Bill mentioned that it's kind of this umbrella organization. One of the things that we're doing is creating a farmer network. And this network right now is being facilitated and led by Will Glazik. Want to stand up or just raise your hand? Great. And so Will brought together an initial group of growers, and I see some of you in this audience. And this idea is that we need farmers to give us ideas in the research community for real relevant research problems. We need to build a core group that wants to learn together, that wants to share information, and that wants to drive the research agenda. So our first meeting for this Idea Farm Network took place a few weeks ago at the BCS plant in Arrowsmith, and I was amazed. We had 45 people attend. It was a good turnout for a first meeting. And so there were a few short talks, a panel with growers, but the really popular part of this meeting was the breakout sessions in which growers were talking to each other. And there was a fair amount of excitement in that room at those tables. I think that people enjoy talking about what goes on their farm. And the group wanted more time for this next meeting. So we're having next week, next Tuesday, at the Crop Sciences Farm First Street Annex, another meeting, and this time rather than just 2 hours, we're meeting for 6 hours. And that was at grower request. So you can contact me or Will. Anybody is welcome to come to this meeting. And the idea is to begin to identify some issues that are on your farms that need more attention. Okay? I've been working on, in my own research program, low input integrated weed management techniques for 20 years. And I have some ideas about what can be done, but I don't want to go to that meeting and impose my ideas on that network. I really want to see what comes out of those roundtable discussions and then be a research facilitator, but with the growers driving the agenda. All right, some things that farmer networks can do. So Bill has already talked a lot about marketing. That can be a natural outgrowth of a group like this. Once you get to know each other, you can share resources, you can pool for one of those color sorting machines or a milling machine. Or in the case of integrated weed management, you might decide that, there are 10 of you who want a Harrington seed destructor so that you can destroy weed seeds in your organic grain operation and make weed management much, much easier than it's been. Advocacy is a whole other part of this that I'm not an expert in, but the Regenerate Illinois group includes entities like the Prairie Rivers Network that can do advocacy. Why would you want a farmer group to do advocacy? Well, if you think about what Central Illinois looks like right now, it looks that way because of very high-level market decisions that have been made, market and policy decisions. And if you don't like the way it looks, or if you want to have the headwinds against cropping system diversification be less strong, it's the people in this room who have to talk to their policymakers about that. I'm actually not allowed to talk and lobby for this kind of thing. I can't, even though I can see the need for better avenues towards cropping system diversification, it's illegal for me to make policy recommendations like that. On the other hand, the people who make these policies listen very carefully to farmers groups. So a growers network that identifies some key obstacles to organic production, that's a powerful voice for change. So the learning part is what I know about. And the learning can take many forms, but I think the most important way to start it is with these learning communities that are parts of these grower networks, right? You can't have, let's say you have a grower network that's 200 people. They're not all going to meet at once and talk about the same thing. On the other hand, if you've got 12 people, 20 people, maybe max, that's a really good size for a group to take on an issue. Maybe it's, breeding organic food quality grains, or maybe it's weed management in organic systems. But that learning community is the essential kind of piece in order to get this going. So some of the things that you can do with those learning communities, you can do demonstration. This is from Paul Muggy's field day back in summer 2000 when I was a student back at Iowa State, and he was doing a diversified production system with corn, soybean, wheat, underseeded with forage legumes. He was using the straw from that production system as bedding for a deep-bedded Swedish hoop house swine production system. Okay, so there's bedding piles. There are the hogs in the system. That bedding goes to about 4 feet deep over time. Very good impacts on swine health and meat quality, reduced odor, reduced price. And the swine end up starting the composting process. Once they're moved out, you windrow compost it, return it back to your fields, thereby reducing environmental impacts and production costs. So this wasn't a research project, this was simply a demonstration, but very powerful for people to come visit and see this example of an integrated farm that was making money. That's a much younger me, and with a learning community of growers in Michigan, where we were meeting throughout a winter and talking about weed management together. And we were doing two things. One was a brain download from the growers. One was a brain download from the researchers and the extension agents. And we used that information to identify opportunities throughout the weed life cycle and the crop life cycle for non-chemical weed management strategies to be implemented. Right now, most of the weed management attention that takes place in organic systems is really focused on a lot of soil disturbance during the seedling stage, but there's a lot of other opportunities. We identified them, described them, and made a book. And that book, some of you received at that meeting a few weeks ago, Integrated Weed Management 1 Year Seeding. That is a farmer-created book I facilitated, but we took those learning communities and created something lasting. That has sold out 3 print runs, and it's used around the world to teach organic and integrated weed management. That was a grower-led effort. So then moving on from that, you can think about simple observational studies where you're just taking a look at what's going on. So you might ask questions as like, how do my yields compare to those of my peers? How does my growing environment influence my yields? How does a new practice work on my farm? So here's an example where you might, in a learning community, have numbers for everybody in the group. Let's say you don't want to be outed about your low yields, but you want to see how your yields compare to those of your peers in your group. You can simply take a look at that distribution of yields and, oh, I'm a lot lower than other folks in the group. Why am I so much lower? And you can start talking to people about that. Or maybe everybody in the group decides that they're going to measure a soil property on their farm and then see whether that relates to yields in the room. And is that soil property something that you have control over? Maybe, maybe not. Other simple observational studies, might just be looking at cover crop growth on your farm. This is from Will Glazik, who a couple years ago started looking at the organic rolled and crimped rye system for controlling weeds, and went ahead, and this was not a randomized trial. This was simply taking a look at this new practice and evaluating it against some of the other beans on his farm. You can move from there into more controlled experiments. How does practice A versus practice B work on my farm? And what's the recommendation area for that practice? So for example, we've got practice A in blue, practice B in white. We've got a bunch of growers in a group. And we take a look at the results from these growers, and we see, over these 6 growers, well, for some of them, practice A is doing better. For some of them, practice B is doing better. And then we take a look at another piece of information. Maybe we decide to look at how those practices perform against average farm yield. When we do that, we may reveal a pattern. So practice B does not perform so well on low-yielding or farms with a poor productive capacity, but on high-yielding farms it does, whereas practice A remains relatively stable across that area. This is called adaptability analysis. It's one of the tools for making sense of on-farm research. Maybe we find that, in fact, that change in those practices relates to some underlying soil property. When we do this kind of analysis, we can then create what are called recommendation zones or recommendation domains. And we can go out on the landscape, and that information now becomes very valuable to your peers because you've not only shown what happens on your farm, you can now say, let's say soil property Z is organic matter, for example. And you can start mapping that out on the landscape where these practices may or may not be good to adopt. I don't have time for this next part, so I'm just going to end with this slide that shows where we're meeting next week. I encourage any of you who have practical questions about production on your farms to come to that meeting. We'll be serving lunch. You're going to meet new people. It'll be exciting. We'll pose some questions to you, but there's going to be lots of face-to-face breakout time. And from that meeting, we're hoping that we'll be able to elevate a few questions that we'll take and put back out on farm in the 2017 growing session. Do I have time for a few questions? Great.
Anyone in the audience for Adam? So, yes. The question was, what kind of variables do you test for in your research? Inputs?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we look at. I tend, in my own weed management research, I'm looking at how different cropping systems are more or less weed suppressive. I look at crop rotations, I look at cover crops, I might look at soil organic amendments, so legume green manures versus composts versus an unamended system. So one of the things I'm trying to figure out, and my work goes from organic all the way to full-on conventional. One of the things I want to know is what's the herbicide replacement value of those other practices. And what I've found is that you can take a dose-response curve of a weed to an herbicide, and you can shift that dramatically to lower herbicide inputs just by doing some of the sustainable practices that organic growers do. So my overall goal in my research program is to reduce reliance on herbicides for weed management. Within an organic system, you don't have the herbicide possibility, but you still want to know how you're performing. And so finding ways of spreading opportunities for weed management throughout the life cycle is a really important thing to study.
Is it easy to say some sort of example of a price difference with production you've seen? Is it easy to name some examples of a cost difference it would take for producing an acre of?
Right, yeah, so creating a partial budget for weed management is a really, or whatever practice, is an important part of all this. So figuring out and keeping track of how many hours it takes you to do a practice, how much money that practice costs, that can allow you then to compare your practices in terms of dollars. And that really ultimately I think is one of the goals of practical on-farm research is this going to help improve my bottom line? Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, please. Oh, yes, Will.
Are there other areas in the Midwest starting these farmer networks?
There are. So I've actually got a grad student in Michigan who's starting one there called Jumpstart. And he's an extension agent with Michigan State. They have 90 growers right now, 3 learning communities, one in Northeast Lower, one in Central Michigan, one in Southwest. And they're in their second year now of a statewide trial on improving soil organic matter. So we're really blessed with high organic matter here. They're starting at 1.5. And so one of the questions is, how does your starting level of organic matter affect your ability to increase organic matter on your farm? And so we've got that across 90 farms with some really good growers, and we're getting great information.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anyone? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Adam Davis for his time and expertise.
Thanks very much.